You have met someone who changed your life without knowing it. So has Steve Harvey. The difference is, his showed up on his stage 17 years later. 14 years into hosting Family Feud, Steve Harvey had developed what his floor director called the recognition pause. It was a half-second, sometimes less, that happened when someone said something, or looked a certain way, or used a particular combination of words that matched something stored deeper than professional memory. Most people in the audience never noticed it. The crew noticed it. They had learned to watch for it because what followed the pause was always worth watching. In 14 years it had happened, by the floor director's informal count, 9 times. On the afternoon of May 7, 2024, it happened a 10th time. And it lasted not a half-second, but a full 4, which in television time is an eternity, and which told everyone in the control room, before Steve said a single word, that whatever had just connected inside him was not small. The family at the left podium was the Larson family from Billings, Montana. There were 5 of them. The father, David, 51, the mother, Christine, 49, their daughter Emma, 24, who was a first-year teacher and who had her mother's precision and her father's warmth in a combination that made her very good at her job. Their son Tyler, 21, who was studying engineering and who buzzed in on instinct the way engineers sometimes do, with complete confidence in a hypothesis that occasionally required revision. And then there was the man standing at the end of the podium, a little apart from the others in the way people stand when they are still not quite sure they deserve to be in a good thing, still half surprised by their own presence in it. His name was James Larson. He was David's brother. He was 47 years old. He had driven from Billings to Atlanta alone, in a truck that he had owned for 3 years, and which was the first vehicle he had purchased new, with his own money, with credit that had taken him 4 years to rebuild from a score of 511, a number he had memorized the way people memorize numbers that have once defined the outer boundary of what was possible for them. He was a pipe fitter. He had been a pipe fitter for 5 years, working on industrial construction sites across Montana and Wyoming, which was hard and physical and paid well, and which he had gotten into through a union apprenticeship program he had found on a bulletin board in a room he had been required to visit weekly for 2 years. He had been out of prison for 7 years. He had served 9 years of a 12-year sentence for a crime he had committed at 31, a crime he described, when he described it at all, as the consequence of a version of himself he had spent the subsequent years doing the work to leave behind. He did not minimize it. He did not dramatize it. He had a way of talking about it that was factual and accountable and entirely without self-pity, which was something his parole officer had noted in a written assessment and which the union apprenticeship coordinator had also noted when James walked into his office in the spring of 2017 with a letter from his parole officer and a handshake that the coordinator said later was the handshake of a man who had decided something. He had not told his family how close he had come to not deciding it. He had not told David, who had visited every month for 9 years and had not missed a single month, and who James knew was the primary reason he was still capable of deciding anything. He had not told Christine, who had included him in every holiday card and every family photograph, and had never once made him feel like an asterisk in the family. He had not told Emma, who had been 7 when he went in and 16 when he came out, and who had looked at him when she was 16 with the unsentimental directness of a teenager who has not yet learned to soften assessments, and had said, "You look different." He had said, "I am." She had nodded. She had gone back to her homework. The thing he had not told them was specific. In the autumn of 2016, in the third year of what would become 4 more years of his sentence, he had been in a place so dark and so absolute that he had stopped writing his brother's name in the visitor log. Not because he didn't want to see David, because he had concluded, in the specific and persuasive logic of that darkness, that David's life was better without the monthly visit, and that the monthly visit was a kindness David performed out of obligation and not love, and that releasing David from it was itself a form of caring. He had removed David's name from the log in October. He had written a letter he did not send, explaining why. He had kept the letter. David had showed up anyway in November. Not on the visitor log, at the facility, asking the front desk why his name had been removed. He had driven 9 hours from Billings. He had stood at the front desk of that facility and been told his name was not on the current list, and had said, quietly and with complete clarity, "I am going to need someone to add it." He had waited for 2 hours in a plastic chair in the lobby. They had added it. He had gone in. James had not been able to look at him for the first 10 minutes of that visit. David had not pushed. He had sat across the table and talked about ordinary things: the truck, a fence he was repairing, a neighbor's dog, until James could look at him. And then he had said, once without elaboration, "I will keep coming." James had said, "You don't have to." David had said, "I know." And then he had changed the subject, and he had kept coming, every month, for 3 more years. James had never told him about the letter. He had never told him what October 2016 had been. He kept the letter in the glove compartment of the truck he now owned, in an envelope addressed to David that had never been sealed, because he had not found the words to explain why it needed to be sent now, years later, when the thing it described was past, and the man who wrote it was someone he was still becoming comfortable calling himself. This was the lie he permitted himself. Not a lie, an absence, a piece of the story he had withheld from the person most owed it, because giving it required explaining the part where he had tried to cut that person loose, and explaining that required trusting that the person would understand. And he was not yet sure enough of his own worthiness of that trust to test it. He had come to Family Feud because Emma had asked him to. She had said, "Uncle James, come." He had said he would think about it. She had said, "Think faster." He had laughed. He had said yes. The Larsons played 2.5 rounds before it happened. They played with the specific warmth of a family that knows how to be together because they have practiced being together through hard things. And the hard things have left them looser and more grateful than families who have not needed to practice. Tyler was fast and creative, and occasionally wrong in ways that were difficult to argue with. Emma was precise. Christine was sharp. David played steadily, without flash, the way he had driven 9 hours to a facility in November 2016. No announcement, no theater, just the thing done because it needed doing. James played carefully and well, and with a slight hesitation on the buzzer that was not uncertainty about the answers, but about the space itself, the being in it, the being somewhere good and not yet fully trusting that he was allowed to stay. The conversation segment. Steve worked through the family. He got to James. He asked what he did. James said, "Pipe fitter." Steve said, "Where?" James said, "Montana mostly, Wyoming sometimes." He said, "I go where the work is." Steve said, "You like it?" James said, "I like that it's mine." Steve said, "What do you mean?" James said, "I earned the credential. I earned the job. I earned the truck I drove here." He said, "I like things I've earned." There was a pause. He said, "I didn't used to." Steve looked at him. The studio fell completely silent. He said, "How long have you been a pipe fitter?" James said, 5 years. Steve said, what were you doing before that? James was quiet for exactly 1 second. He said, I was incarcerated. He said it the way he said the hard things, factually, accountably, without the performance of shame or the performance of defiance. He said, I've been out 7 years. He said, my brother drove 9 hours every month for 9 years to make sure I came out. He looked at David. He said, that's the only reason I'm here. David, standing at the podium, looked at the floor. His jaw moved once, the way jaws move when a person is managing something carefully. Christine put her hand on his arm. The studio fell completely silent. Steve Harvey had been looking at James Larson with a specific quality of attention since the moment James said, I like things I've earned. He had the recognition pause on his face. The crew could see it. The floor director noted it. He was looking at James the way you look at something when the edges of a memory are trying to make contact with the present and haven't quite closed the distance. He said, Billings, Montana. James said, yes. Steve said, what facility? James named it. Steve Harvey was still for a long moment. He looked at James Larson. He looked at the floor briefly. He looked back. He said, I remember exactly who you are. The studio fell completely silent. James looked at him. He said, I'm sorry? Steve said, 2009. He said, I did a comedy tour. He said, part of the tour was a show at a correctional facility in Montana. He said, I do not remember every face. He said, I remember yours. He said, you were in the front row. He said, you laughed at something I said that nobody else laughed at. He said, I looked at you because of it. He said, you were 31 years old and you looked like a man who had not laughed in a long time and was surprised that he was laughing. He said, I have thought about that face a handful of times over the years. He said, not often, but a handful. He said, and it is your face. James Larson had gone completely still. The studio fell completely silent again and stayed there. Steve said, do you remember the show? James said very quietly, I remember the show. Steve said, you laughed at the bit about the grocery store. James looked at him. He said, yeah. Steve said, almost to himself, 15 years. The studio fell completely silent for the 3rd time. A camera operator named Bernard said later that he had been in television for 20 years and that he had filmed things he thought he would remember forever and then forgotten them, and that he would not forget the expression on Steve Harvey's face in that moment. Not emotion exactly, but the look of a man who has just understood that something he did, without knowing it mattered, had mattered. That the face in the front row had carried that moment through 15 years and a prison sentence and a pipe-fitting credential and a truck bought with rebuilt credit and a drive to Atlanta, and was standing right here in front of him, having arrived at the other side of something. Bernard said he kept his camera on Steve's face and cried behind the eyepiece and kept it steady anyway, which he said was the hardest professional thing he had done in 20 years. But Steve wasn't done. He stood and he turned to the audience, and his face was not composed, and he did not try to compose it. He said, I want to tell you what just happened. He said, 15 years ago I stood in a room in Montana and told jokes to men who were incarcerated, and one of them laughed at something nobody else laughed at, and I noticed his face, and I have thought about it occasionally over 15 years without knowing why. And he is standing on this stage right now, in a suit, having driven here in a truck he bought with money he earned. He stopped. He said, I want to talk to everyone watching at home. He said, you do not always know which moment matters. You do not always know when you are doing the thing that reaches somebody. He said, I went to that facility because it was the right thing to do. I did not go because I expected it to come back to me. He said, "It came back to me today, 15 years later, on my own stage." He said, "Do the thing anyway. Do it without expecting it to return." He said, "It will return in ways you cannot predict. It will return on a Tuesday in May, 15 years from now, and it will be standing in front of you in a suit, and you will remember its face." The studio fell completely silent. The opposing family, the Osei family from Charlotte, a mother and 4 adult children who had been extraordinary competitors all afternoon, had gone still at their podium. The mother, Abina, 62, raised her hand. She walked to the center of the stage. She looked at James. She said, "My son was incarcerated for 4 years. She said, "Someone visited him. A minister from a church that didn't know our family, from a congregation we had never attended. He came every month." She said, "My son has been out for 6 years. He is in Charlotte. He is doing well." She said, "I have never been able to say thank you to that minister in a room large enough to match what he did." She looked at Steve. She said, "This room is large enough. Thank you. To everyone who goes. To everyone who shows up without knowing if it matters. It matters." She walked back to her family. Her eldest daughter put an arm around her. The studio fell completely silent for the last time. But Steve wasn't done. He spoke to James directly. He said, "The letter." James looked at him startled. Steve said, "Whatever you are carrying that belongs to someone else in this room, give it to them today, not later, today." James looked at David. David was looking at him. James said very quietly, "I have something to tell you." David said, "I know." He said, "I've been waiting." James said, "You knew?" David said, "I knew something happened in October. I knew because you took my name off the list." He said, "I figured you'd tell me when you were ready." He said, "I've been ready to hear it for a while." James looked at his brother for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once. David nodded back. That was all. They did not embrace on stage. They did not need to. Something had been passed between them in those 2 nods that the audience felt without being able to name. The way audiences feel the things that are too private for performance and too real for theater. The Larsons won fast money. They won $24,000. Tyler lost his composure entirely and had to be steadied by Emma. Christine laughed the specific laugh of a woman who has carried a great deal and is being allowed for one afternoon to set it down. James stood at the end of the podium and looked at the board, and his face did the thing faces do when a number confirms something you have been telling yourself slowly, carefully, for 7 years. That you are someone who gets to win things now. That the possibility is yours. That the truck and the credential and the rebuilt credit and the drive to Atlanta were not anomalies, but evidence of a direction. And the direction has been correct all along. The clip went up on a Friday. 29 million views by Sunday. 53 million by the following Friday. The union apprenticeship program that James had found on a bulletin board received, in the 2 weeks following the broadcast, an increase in both applications and donations that its director described as unlike anything in the program's 19-year history. A correctional facility chaplain in Ohio posted the clip on the facility's internal bulletin with a note that read, "This is why we go." A woman in Denver wrote in the comments that her husband had been in the audience at a comedy show in a facility in 2011, and that she was going to show him this clip tonight. A man in Houston wrote, "I did time. Someone came. I never forgot it. I don't think they know. I hope they see this." 3 months after the taping, James Larson sat in his truck in the parking lot of a diner in Billings and read David the letter. Not the whole letter. He read the part that mattered, the part about October 2016, the part about removing the name from the log. David listened without interrupting. When James finished reading, David was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know." James said, "You said that." David said, "I want to say it again." He said, "I know, and I came anyway, and I would come again." James folded the letter. He put it back in the envelope. He put it in the glove compartment. He has not thrown it away. He says he will keep it there, in the truck he earned, because it is proof of what October 2016 was, which is also proof of how far he has come from it. And both things deserve to be remembered. A year after the taping, Emma Larson used the story in a lesson with her second graders. She was teaching them about the things we do for each other without knowing if they will matter. She told them that her uncle laughed at something once, a long time ago, and that the person who made him laugh remembered his face for 15 years, and that her uncle had driven to Atlanta and stood on a stage, and the two of them had seen each other again. One of the children asked if her uncle was happy now. Emma said yes. The child asked if the other man was happy now. Emma said yes. The child considered this. Then the child said, "So laughing was important." Emma said, "Yes." She said, "It usually is. There are moments that move through time the way light moves, forward, invisibly, without announcing their arrival, reaching a surface years later and illuminating something that was there all along. A man laughed in a front row in Montana in 2009, and a man on a stage noticed his face, and neither of them knew what that exchange had started. What it had started was 15 years of two people moving toward each other from different directions. One through comedy tours and network television, and the specific loneliness of a famous man who remembers a face he cannot place. One through a prison sentence, and a parole board, and a union bulletin board, and a truck purchased on rebuilt credit. Until the morning of May 7th, 2024, when the distance finally closed on a stage in Atlanta, and two men looked at each other across 15 years and knew exactly where they had been before. Do the thing anyway, without knowing if it will matter. It will matter. If this reached you, hit the like button now. It matters more than you know. Subscribe to this channel because every week there is a story like this one waiting to be told. And share this with someone who shows up for people without knowing if it makes a difference. Today, because it does, and they deserve to know.